The runner zombie burst out of the tree line at a full sprint, and I had maybe 2 seconds to stop it before it tore my throat out. There was no warning and no build-up, just the explosive crunch of something hitting the snow, and then it was across the clearing as I planted my feet and swung. I missed. The zombie hit me with its shoulder and drove me down onto one knee. It grabbed at my pack, its face inches from mine, gray skin, milky eyes, and a sound coming out of it that I still hear sometimes when I close my eyes. I shoved the hockey stick across its throat with both hands, forced it back, and got to my feet. Then I swung again. The first hit connected with the side of its head and made it stagger. The second nearly spun it around. The fourth dropped it into the snow. I stood over the corpse at 4,000 feet, with the wind cutting across the ridge and my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the stick. Something was smeared across the front of my jacket. I wiped it away without looking. Last fall, I'd been sitting in my apartment in the city, debugging code, and deciding what to order for dinner. My name is Cassy Thomas. I'm 28 years old. I used to be a software engineer. I had a good apartment, a job I was good at, and a life that made sense. Then my boyfriend left me for my best friend, and I lost almost everyone who mattered to me in the process, including all of my friends. I spent weeks alone in my apartment, grieving the collapse of my life. Then the dead started walking. I spent months hiding in my apartment, alone and scared, grieving a life that was already falling apart before the world ended. When I finally ran out of reasons to stay, I headed east toward the mountains, with a backpack, a hockey stick, and no real plan. This is how I survived the zombie apocalypse. The fire had been going for 6 hours. Distant screaming came from that direction, and half-aflamed zombies were throwing themselves out of shattered glass panes. The others crawling the streets were gravitating toward the fire and the screaming and the explosions coming from that building. They had formed a cluster around it, emptying most of the streets and alleys I could see from my apartment. I watched it from the window. 2 blocks east, maybe 3. An apartment building, the Oasis, I think, the one with the green awning, going up in a column of orange. No sirens. There hadn't been sirens in weeks. The water had stopped 3 days ago. I'd been melting snow scraped off the window ledge over the camping stove, which was exactly as miserable as it sounds. My last real shower was a memory I'd stopped revisiting. I had 7 tins of soup, canned tuna, and corned beef left, along with 2 ramen packs, a couple of packets of cookies, and half a bag of rice I couldn't cook because I was rationing the 2 gas canisters Daniel and I had bought last summer, with the camping stove for a camping trip we never actually took. The pantry that had kept me alive all winter, the one I'd stocked every month without fail, through expensive grocery runs I'd done on autopilot, because cooking was the one thing I did for myself that had nothing to do with the screen, was almost gone. I'd known for 2 weeks that I was going to have to leave. The fire made the decision for me, because it would spread eventually, and even if it didn't, another would start somewhere nearby, or here itself. I packed in 20 minutes, using my laptop backpack because it was the only bag I had, and filling it with the tins, the ramen, the cookies, the lighter I'd kept from a brief smoking phase, a couple of kitchen knives from the block by the stove, half a roll of duct tape, and my offline map, printed from a Reddit thread 6 months ago, titled Urban Evacuation Routes, What Actually Works, which I had read approximately 40 times and still didn't fully trust, along with a change of clothes. His mug was still hanging on the hook by the door, blue and chipped on the handle, a tech conference giveaway from 3 years ago. He'd left it behind. He'd left most things behind, actually. He probably had a better place to be. The hockey stick was leaning against the wall, signed across the blade in black marker that was already starting to fade. I'd spent 4 months tracking it down. He'd cried a little when I gave it to him, and then he'd forgotten it, the same way he'd forgotten me. I picked it up on the way out. I told myself it was practical, which was true, but also not the whole truth. I locked the apartment door behind me out of muscle memory, and the click of the deadbolt in that particular building silence was the loneliest sound I'd ever heard. The stairwell smelled wrong before I reached the second-floor landing. Not the smell of vomit and piss left behind by drunk residents, but the other smell, revolting and dense and biological. The kind that invaded your nose and mouth and seemed to consume you. I stopped. He was in the corner of the landing below me, a walker, what I'd started calling the slow zombies. He'd been a large man once. Now he was a large thing, listing against the wall with his head down and his arms hanging loose at his sides, making no sound at all except for the faint, wet pull of breath. I counted in my head, because it was the only thing that helped. 1, 2, 3. He hadn't looked up. His eyes, when I'd caught a glimpse of them, were the color of old milk and pointed at nothing in particular. The zombie's eyes always looked like that, as though they were watching something in a frequency you couldn't access. He drifted. That was the word for it, because they didn't walk so much as drift, pulled by some current I couldn't detect. He moved away from the landing and through the open door into the second-floor hallway, his shoulder dragging along the plaster and leaving a dark smear. I pressed myself against the railing, the hockey stick held horizontally across my body so it wouldn't clip the banister, and went down the stairs one step at a time. I didn't breathe again until I reached the ground floor. The lobby was clear. The front door had been propped open months ago, probably by the fire door mechanism, or maybe by someone who'd left in a hurry and never come back. Cold April air moved through it as though the building itself was exhaling. Outside, everything was the color of ash. I'd planned my route east. The I-90 was the obvious move, but obvious meant traffic, and traffic meant cars, and cars meant people had tried to leave that way, and people who'd tried to leave that way were now zombies blocking the road. I went north 2 blocks first, then cut east through the back streets, the ones I'd used when I wanted to avoid the main drag on a Sunday morning. The city smelled like smoke and something older. Buildings stood with their windows dark. A car had gone through a storefront on Pike. A nice car, the kind with a lease, and just stayed there, half in and half out, as though it were still waiting for someone to come deal with it. Nobody had come to deal with anything for a long time. I saw 4 zombies in the first 6 blocks, 2 walkers shuffling along the opposite side of the road, unhurried and going nowhere, one standing in the entrance of a pharmacy doing absolutely nothing, and one on its knees in the intersection at Broadway, with its head down and both hands flat on the asphalt. I went around all of them in wide arcs, staying downwind where I could manage it, and moving slowly over the gravel patches. The smell hit me anyway. It always hit me. I'd tried breathing through my mouth, through my sleeve, through a fistful of my own hair. Nothing worked. I gagged twice, quietly, into the collar of my jacket, and it was a good thing I didn't have enough food in my stomach to throw up. The runner found me on Madison, 4 blocks from the city's eastern fringe. I heard it before I saw it, the growling and the strange dragging rhythm of its run. And when I turned, it was already close. Far too close. Moving down the center of the road with its head tilted at an angle that made my stomach flip. I stepped sideways into the recess of a shuttered doorway and made myself as small as I could, pressing my back against the door, pulling the hockey stick tight against my body, and stopping my breathing altogether. The runner passed 8 feet from me. Up close, they were worse than the walkers. The walkers at least had the dignity of decomposition, because they were going to ground slowly, which was terrible but comprehensible. The runners looked almost intact. This one had been a woman, and she moved at a speed that made no sense for what she was, her head snapping left and right at every tiny sound, whether it was a piece of glass settling or a flag rope tapping against a pole 3 blocks away. Over the winter, from broadcasts and from what little I'd observed from my balcony before everything stopped, I'd worked out that they navigated almost entirely by sound. Their vision was nearly gone. She went past. I let the air out of my lungs in a thin, controlled stream and counted to 50 before I moved again. The last zombie I dealt with before I cleared the city wasn't a close call. It was a choice. A walker stood squarely in the middle of the road at the eastern edge, at the last intersection before Capitol Hill gave way to the long suburban corridor that eventually became foothills. It was just standing there between me and the road east, with nothing on either side I could navigate without going deep into a parking structure I had no desire to enter. I thought about waiting, but I couldn't risk another runner coming up behind me, and I couldn't risk standing exposed in the open. I tightened my grip on the hockey stick. I came in from the side, moving fast, and I swung. The first hit landed across the shoulder and knocked it sideways, not down. They didn't go down easily, something the movies had catastrophically misrepresented, because they absorbed impact, staggered, and came back, slower and confused. I swung again, lower this time, and the crack of composite shaft against skull was a sound I knew I would never forget. It dropped. I didn't look at it on the ground. The brief glimpse I caught at the moment of impact was enough to make me gag. The cascades were visible from the edge of the city, distant and indifferent, with snow still clinging to the high peaks even in late April. I looked at them and thought, that's where I'm going. My pack weighed 17 pounds. My boots were not hiking boots, but simply the most robust thing I owned, a pair of chunky soled sneakers I'd bought 2 years earlier. My hands already had blisters from the hockey stick rubbing against my palms. I did not feel brave. I felt like someone who had run out of other options. I'd already lost everything once when I was 15. You keep moving. You don't wait for it to feel okay. You just keep moving until one day it's behind you. My world had ended multiple times before. This apocalypse was just another version of the same thing. I walked. The suburbs east of the city thinned out over 2 days of walking. Strip malls, then gas stations, then scattered houses with long driveways, then nothing. The road narrowed. The Douglas firs closed in from both sides until the sky was a gray strip above me, and everything else was dark green and wet. The Skycomish River ran somewhere to my left, audible but not visible, a constant low roar I oriented by without deciding to. It had been raining since the first afternoon. Not hard, just the steady, indifferent Pacific Northwest rain. My sneakers soaked through on day one and stayed that way. No car alarms, no distant crashes, no fires, just rain and river and the occasional crack of something in the undergrowth that I stopped dead for every single time. I saw 2 walkers in the first 3 days, both alone, both moving through the trees at that drifting shuffle. The forest floor was soft, pine, duff, and fern, which meant they moved quietly, which meant I heard them later than I wanted to. I went still both times. The second one passed close enough that I could see what it had been wearing. A flannel shirt, hiking boots, good ones, better than mine. I did not think about that. The berries were red and clustered and grew at eye level off a bush I didn't recognize. I ate a handful because I'd been walking for 4 days on half rations, and my hands were shaking. I watched a bird land on the same bush and peck at them. The bird flew away. I took this as sufficient evidence. It was not sufficient evidence. By evening, I knew something was wrong. I spent an hour convincing myself I could walk it off. By full dark, I couldn't stand without holding onto a tree. The forest had become a blur of wet trunks and shadows. My stomach cramped every few minutes. Sweat soaked my shirt despite the cold rain. I needed shelter, not comfort. Just somewhere to stop moving. I found it by accident. An old oak had split years ago, leaving a curved hollow inside the trunk where the heartwood had rotted away. The opening was narrow, half hidden behind ferns and hanging vines. I squeezed through sideways and found a cramped chamber, barely large enough to sit in with my knees against my chest. It wasn't much, but it was enclosed. From outside, the entrance looked like another patch of darkness between roots and undergrowth. A zombie would have to be almost on top of it to notice. I dragged fallen branches and my pack against the opening and piled dead leaves around them. Not enough to stop anything determined, enough to hide, enough to make me feel like I'd done something. I spent most of the night curled against the inside wall while my system rejected everything I'd eaten in the previous 6 hours. When it ran out of anything to empty the dehydration hit. Whenever it rained, I pushed a hand through the branches covering the entrance and caught what water I could in my palm. Later, I spread my jacket across the opening and, once it was soaked, wrung rainwater into my mouth. I didn't use my bottle. The hollow echoed strangely, and I was convinced the sound would carry. The fever came up overnight. 2 days, maybe 3. Time became difficult to measure. Sometimes I woke to rain, drumming against the trunk. Sometimes to silence. Once I spent 10 minutes listening to what I thought was someone speaking nearby, before realizing it was water running through leaves. The dead were out there too. Distant growls, the occasional groan drifting through the trees. Once I counted at least 7 passing somewhere beyond the ferns. At some point I heard footsteps. Soft, irregular, close. I lay completely still with my cheek against the damp wood, and a pulse in my ears so loud I was certain it could hear me. The footsteps passed. I didn't move until they had faded for a long time. When the fever broke, I ate the last of the crackers and sat with my back against the log, staring up at the tree canopy. I'd nearly died of berries. I wrote "not" the red clustered ones in capital letters in the margin of my map. Then I drew a small, unhappy face next to it. The next morning, I started walking again. Around midday, I caught the smell of wood smoke and followed it to a camp built into a shallow ravine off a logging road. Timber walls, wooden pikes, camo netting, stacked supplies. Marcus was skinning a squirrel when I arrived. The hide from the first one hung nearby. He was mid-50s, heavy-set, beard past the point of unkempt. He handed me a bowl of squirrel stew. I stared at it for a moment, then ate it anyway. Hunger had long since outranked preference. Then he started talking. The outbreak, he said, proved he'd been right all along. He used the word cleansing twice. He asked if I was alone. I said yes, and immediately wished I hadn't. Nothing about him was openly threatening. Nothing about him felt right, either. I left before dawn the next morning. He didn't follow. I didn't look back. The morning I left Marcus's camp, I found blackberries, or what I hoped were blackberries. A doe stood beside a logging road clearing, pulling fruit from a tangle of thorny vines sprawled over a fallen stump. I watched her for several minutes. She ate. She remained alive. Given my recent track record, this seemed worth noting. The berries were dark, purple-black, and elongated, not quite like the blackberries I remember from supermarkets. I studied the leaves, the canes, the fruit, then waited a little longer. The deer wandered off. I ate one berry, then another, then several more. They tasted like something from before. After I was full, I dug an empty soup can out of my pack and filled it with as many berries as I could fit. Future me could worry about whether they would survive the hike. I stood there longer than I could afford to. Forest dripping around me, river below, everything smelling like wet earth and pine. Then a branch cracked somewhere uphill, and I was moving before I'd finished identifying the sound. I built my first successful fire on a dry evening when the rain finally broke. I made it on a patch of bare ground near the riverbank. It took 3 attempts. Even with a lighter, everything in the forest was damp. I shaved dry wood from the inside of a dead branch, gathered twigs, then larger sticks. The first fire died, the second smoked, the third caught. When I went to fetch water, I brushed a plant and felt the familiar sting on my wrist. A distant memory surfaced. A book I'd read years ago mentioning nettles. Mostly I remembered the warning about the itch. I'd filed that information away and somehow kept it. I picked a handful and carried them back with the water. I filled an empty food tin from the river, boiled the water, topped up my bottle, then boiled the nettles. They tasted vaguely like spinach. Good enough. I decided to save the last packet of ramen for another day. I wrote nettles. Yes, in the map margin, next to the unhappy face. The fire popped, the trees dripped, the river kept moving. I ate, watched the flames, and for a little while thought about almost nothing at all. The trees thinned 3 days out from the pass. First the firs got shorter, scraggier, further apart, then alpine scrub, low and wind-beaten, clinging to rock. Then exposed ridge and gray sky and silence. Snow started an hour into the upper climb. Old and crusted, the kind that holds at elevation, even in early May. My sneakers punched through with every other step and filled with meltwater. I kept moving. The fog came down mid-afternoon, thick and fast, reducing everything to 10 feet of road. I heard the campsite before I saw it. A loose flapping sound, something unsecured in the wind. It was small. A fire ring with old ash, 2 tent pads, a wooden storage box on a post, and a cabin the size of a garden shed, with the door left open. The flapping was a tarp, one corner pulled loose, snapping against the cabin wall. 2 tents, both collapsed. A camp stove tipped on its side. I clocked it and kept scanning. 3 zombies, 2 walkers moving slowly between the tent pads, one crouched near the fire ring, all of them turning toward me at roughly the same moment. I took the first walker with 2 swings, shoulder, then skull. It dropped. The second reached me before I reset, and I shoved it back with the stick across its chest, bought 2 steps of distance, and swung hard from the side. The crack echoed off the tree line. The one at the fire ring was slower. It caught my jacket sleeve as it went down. I ripped back hard and stumbled, but stayed on my feet. Then I heard the runner. It came from the tree line to the north, already at full speed, already locked. No warning, just the explosive crunch of something hitting the snow at a dead sprint. And then it was across the clearing, and I had no time to do anything except plant my feet and swing. The first swing missed. The runner hit me with its shoulder and I went down onto one knee in the snow. It grabbed at my pack, its face inches from mine. I shoved the stick across its throat with both hands and pushed it back and got to my feet and swung again. Connected across the side of the head. It staggered. I swung again and again. The 4th hit dropped it. I stood over it breathing hard. Something on my jacket that I wiped off on the snow without looking at. Then I went around the entire perimeter, into the trees on all 4 sides, far enough to see between the trunks, listening. I didn't know what made some turn fast and others slow. What I knew was that I wasn't spending the night somewhere I hadn't cleared. The campsite was clear. The tents told the story well enough, both sleeping bags still inside, personal gear still packed. One of the tents had a larger pack inside. Internal frame, better straps, better weight distribution. I transferred everything into it in the wind, fingers going numb. The pack sat better. The camp stove on the ground was a single burner backpacking model. The gas canister was half full. I grabbed both. The cabin door I pushed open with the stick first. One small room, a wooden sleeping platform, a shelf with waterlogged paperbacks, a smoke-blackened pot hook above a tiny hearth. On the shelf, wedged between the paperbacks, bear spray. Orange safety cap still on. Full weight when I hefted it. I clipped it to the outside of the pack, where I could reach it fast. Then I noticed the bag hanging from a hook from the roof. Inside, 2 protein bars, a bag of trail mix, a packet of instant oatmeal, a dented can of chili with the label half torn off. I ate 1 protein bar standing there in the doorway, my hair flapping in the wind. I spent the night in the cabin. The padlock was long gone, but it had 3 barrel bolts from the inside. I ate the chili cold from the can, half the trail mix, and boiled water on the camp stove with the door shut. I laid the hockey stick next to me on the platform and drifted off to a restless sleep. Sometime in the deep dark, I heard it outside. Not a walker. Something else. Moving, stopping, moving again, circling the cabin walls. It went around once, twice. Stopped at the door. I sat on the platform in the dark with the hockey stick in one hand and the bear spray in the other. It left. I sat with my back against the wall and watched the gaps in the wood go from black to gray to pale, flat morning light. I checked the perimeter in the cold dawn and made some oatmeal on the camp stove. First hot breakfast in what felt like ages. Then I stood outside the cabin, looking east. Below, through a gap in the ridge, the valley. Brown and gold and dry, the river catching pale sun far below. I picked up the pack and the hockey stick and walked toward it. The valley was warmer than the pass by 15 degrees and smelled like pine sap and dry earth. I followed the logging road down until it hit a gravel track running east along the river. The Wenatchee moved fast here, gray-green and cold, pushing hard around the bends. I stayed on the track and kept the river to my left. The east slope was drier, opener, the trees more spread out. I could see further. I was rationing hard. 1 tin a day, split morning and evening. The protein bars from the campsite were gone. I found wild onion on the riverbank and ate it raw without stopping walking. I smelled the camp before I found it. Wood smoke, old and cold. And underneath it, the other smell. I left the track and moved through the trees. It was a small clearing off the river, sheltered on 3 sides by rock and pine. A good camp, well-made lean-to, clay windbreak around the fire ring, rope lines between the trees. Someone had been here a while and knew what they were doing. Both of them were on the ground. A man and a woman, middle-aged, recently dead. Hours maybe, definitely not days. I did a slow scan of the clearing and the tree line. Nothing moving. No walkers in the immediate area. I moved closer and crouched down and looked at them properly. No bites, no tearing. Gunshot wounds, both of them. Clean and deliberate. I stood up and looked at the tree line for a long time. Then I worked fast. Their packs were inside the lean-to, organized and well-stocked. I went through both without letting myself slow down. I found 4 tins, sardines and tomato soup, a half-full bag of pasta, and a small jar of peanut butter nearly gone. Some salt. I transferred everything into my pack. A folding knife I clipped to my belt immediately. A proper water filter, pump and cartridge. A headlamp with fresh batteries. A fire-starting kit. A dry bag. Their spare clothing was rolled and packed separately. I took the woman's extra jacket, fleece-lined, my size roughly, and a wool hat. I put both on immediately. The warmth was immediate, and I did not think about it. The map was in the man's breast pocket, laminated, folded into quarters, soaked through with blood on one side. I scraped the surface clean against the edge of my knife blade, working carefully until I could read it. Road map of Washington east of the Cascades. Annotations in 2 different inks. Routes marked, some crossed out. Locations circled and labeled. A church outside Leavenworth. Cleared, supplies. A farmhouse off Route 2. A void. A bridge crossing. Washed out. They had marked their current location in pencil. A small X on the river track, 3 days east of the pass. And at the bottom, circled twice in red marker, and underlined, Lake Chelan, East Shore. Settlement. Real. We heard it. And a radio frequency scribbled next to it. I folded the map and put it in my breast pocket. I picked up my pack and the hockey stick and left the clearing without looking back at them. Whoever had done this was somewhere ahead of me, or behind me, or gone entirely. I didn't know which, and I couldn't do anything about any of them. I moved fast and put distance between myself and the camp, and didn't stop until the light started going. I found a hollow that night where a boulder had sheared away from a rock face, and left a gap just wide enough, low ceiling, 1 entrance, dry floor of compacted earth. I'd started looking for these on instinct. Anything with 1 entrance I could block, anything the size of me and not much else. Caves, culverts, the spaces under collapsed structures where the debris made a roof. anything I couldn't be surrounded in. I dragged a rotting log across the entrance, wedged vertically, and pushed my pack against it. Not enough to stop anything determined, enough to visually block anything passing by, and make noise if something pushed through, which was the point. I kept a knife at the ready. The stick would not do me any good in the close quarters. I'd stopped expecting to feel safe. I'd started settling for an early warning. They had written "real" in red capital letters. 2 people, prepared and experienced, heading to the same place. Their camp had been good. Their gear had been good. Someone had shot them anyway. I ate the last of the peanut butter with my finger, put the jar in the pack, and closed my eyes. The river moved outside in the dark, constant and indifferent. I did not think about the 2 people in the clearing. I was getting better at that. The valley opened up over the next 3 days. The tree cover thinned, and the river widened, and the mountains dropped behind me. The orchards appeared on both sides of the track. Long rows of unpruned trees, bare-branched. A few shriveled remnants clung to the higher branches, dried to leather. I pulled 2 down and chewed them anyway and kept walking. The map was proving accurate. The washed-out bridge was where they'd marked it. I found a crossing half a mile upstream, rocks breaking the surface, passable if I was careful. I took my sneakers off and tied them to the pack and crossed in socks, the water shockingly cold, the rocks slippery underfoot. Hockey stick down into the current as a brace, both hands on it, feeling the push against the shaft. 12 steps. Far bank. I wrung out my socks, put my sneakers back on, watched the tree line. Nothing. Wild ramps off the track that afternoon. Smelled them before I saw them, sharp onion cutting through the pine. Pulled a fistful and ate them while I walked. Found nettles further on and rolled them into the dry bag. The canyon section came on the 3rd day. The track dropped, and the river narrowed between high rock walls, loud and fast and green in the shadow of the cliffs. The track ran along a ledge above the water, 4 feet wide, rock face left, 15-foot drop to the river right, 100 meters of exposed ledge before the valley opened up again. 8 walkers on the ledge, spread out along the full length, some facing the rock wall, some facing the river, all of them doing that fixed directionless drift. I pulled back around the bend and sat against the rock face and watched them for 20 minutes. There was no way I would sneak past all of them in that narrow ledge. I had to find a different way. I went back the way I'd come. Half a mile back, there was a point where the canyon wall was low enough to step up onto. Barely a step, just a lip of rock. I pushed up into the forest above the canyon and went through it parallel to the river, pushing through undergrowth. No path. No visibility. The hockey stick went in front of me like a probe, tipped down, checking the ground before each step. The terrain was uneven and root-crossed, and twice I went down to one knee. It took 2 hours to cover the distance the ledge would have taken 10 minutes. I came back down to the track, 50 meters past where the ledge ended. Sneakers soaked through again, a long scratch on my forearm from a branch I hadn't seen in time. I checked the track in both directions and kept going east. The marked tree was an hour east of the canyon. A Douglas fir at a track junction, a fresh blaze cut into the bark at eye level. Wedged into a crack below it, orange tent fabric folded tight. Inside, a note on the back of a food wrapper. E-shore. Follow river. Keep going. No name. No date. I read it 3 times. I put it in my breast pocket next to the laminated map and followed the river. The scavengers came on the 5th day, voices from the far bank, low but not low enough. I was on an open stretch of track, and I dropped flat into the long grass without thinking and pressed myself into the ground. 2 of them on the far bank, heading south, both with packs. The taller one had a rifle across his back, moving fast, talking to each other in the way people did when they thought they were alone. The shorter one stopped and scanned my bank. Slow, practiced, left to right. I had my face turned sideways against the earth, one eye open, watching through the grass stems. The scan moved across my position and kept going. They kept walking south. I counted to 300 before I lifted my face from the ground. Got to my knees. Checked the far bank. Empty. Moved fast into the tree line. Put 3 rows of trees between myself and the river. Crouched behind a trunk. And waited another 10 minutes. The couple in the clearing had been shot. These 2 were heading south, armed, moving fast, and not being careful about noise. I waited until the light started going before I moved again. I found a sleeping spot where a creek cut into the bank, a low overhang of compacted earth and roots, deep enough to fit my whole body. Packed the entrance with dead branches. I ate cold sardines from a can and spread the map on my knees. Leavenworth was a day and a half out. A town, real streets, real buildings, more zombies, more places to hide, more places for people to hide too. I put the map away and listened to the creek and the wind until I slept. Leavenworth appeared around a bend in the river just after midday. I'd seen photographs before the world ended. Christmas lights, Oktoberfest, tourists drinking beer beneath painted balconies while pretending Central Washington was somehow Bavaria. From half a mile away, it still looked exactly like that. White walls crossed with dark timber, steep roofs, church spires, colorful shop fronts, flower boxes hanging beneath windows that would never be watered again. For a moment, it looked untouched. Then I noticed the movement. They were everywhere. Zombies wandered through Front Street in loose clusters. Others stood motionless outside cafes with menus still propped on easels. Some drifted across the town square. Others leaned against shop windows or shuffled through intersections where nobody had driven for months. There weren't dozens. There were hundreds. I crouched behind a fallen pine overlooking the town and watched for nearly 15 minutes. Families, older couples, hikers wearing expensive backpacks, cyclists still in bright racing jerseys, a man in lederhosen with one sock pulled halfway down his shin, someone wearing mouse ears, children, far more children than I'd expected. One little boy wandered in circles around a drinking fountain with a plush dinosaur hanging from one hand. A girl in a pink raincoat stood perfectly still outside an ice cream shop, one shoe missing. Near the center of town, a woman pushed a stroller. She kept pushing it. The stroller was empty. No, I muttered quietly. I had no interest in fighting my way through that. The river curved around the northern edge of town before bending east again. The trees there were thicker. If I stayed in the forest, I could avoid almost all of Leavenworth. Almost. I looked down at my shoes. The soles were nearly smooth. The stitching along the left toe had finally split. Every puddle soaked through within seconds. My socks had become different levels of damp rather than dry or wet. I needed proper boots. I also smelled terrible. I'd been wearing the same clothes for weeks. Smoke. Mud. River water. Sweat. Zombie blood. Every layer carried its own memory. I could bypass the town, or I could die later because I'd refused to take a risk now. I circled north. The outdoor equipment shop sat on the edge of town beside a fuel station, with its back parking lot facing the forest, its front windows already smashed by whoever had come before me. Inside, the shelves had been stripped almost bare. Sleeping bags, tents, cooking gear, water bottles, all of it gone. Previous scavengers had been thorough. Near the back wall, I found a boot display that had somehow escaped notice. Most of the boxes were empty. Some weren't. And by luck, there was a single pair left that matched me. I sat on the floor and pulled my ruined sneakers off. My feet looked bad. The skin across both heels white and waterlogged. One toenail blackened from weeks ago. I pulled on thick wool socks before the boots, laced them, and stood up. The difference was immediate in a way I didn't have words for. Support. Dry wool. Proper grip underfoot. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. I was pulling a lightweight waterproof shell from a rack when I heard footsteps. not a runner's rhythm, the slow, dragging kind. I slid behind the checkout counter and lowered myself until only my eyes cleared the edge. 4 of them had come through the front doors, a family, moving the way they all moved, unhurried and going nowhere in particular. I watched them work their way deeper into the store. When I couldn't hear them anymore, I left through the stockroom. The grocery store was a block east, an independent place. Automatic doors, frozen half open. The shelves had been hit hard. Pasta, rice, anything shelf-stable in the obvious places already cleared. I moved fast through the back aisles. Peanut butter, oatmeal, jerky, canned beans, chocolate, a bottle of multivitamins, water purification tablets from behind the pharmacy counter. I was reaching for a second tin of beans when my elbow caught one balanced at the shelf edge. It hit the floor. The sound was preposterous. A tin can on tile in a silent building. I was already moving. Back corridor, employees only, kitchen, delivery bay. The rear door stuck and then gave with a crack and I came out into the alley. A small delivery truck sat backed against the loading dock, its rear doors unlocked, the cargo hold empty except for a folded, moving blanket and a smell of old cardboard. I pulled the door shut behind me and sat in the dark. Then I heard them. Beyond Leavenworth, the trail dropped toward the Wenatchee Valley. The map led me east for another day before turning north to follow Columbia. It felt wrong at first. After months of measuring my progress by how far east I'd managed to travel, turning left almost felt like giving up ground. But Rivers didn't care about my sense of direction, and whoever had drawn the map clearly knew the country better than I did. It broadened as it moved east, no longer confined between canyon walls, but winding through open country, where the hills rolled away toward the lake. The forests became patches, instead of endless stretches. Pine gave way to sagebrush in places, and the air smelled warmer than it had since I'd left Seattle. Every evening, I unfolded the laminated map beside whatever shelter I'd found. The folds had started to wear white. One corner had torn and been repaired with a strip of duct tape. The red circle around Lake Chelan, East Shore, had become as familiar as my own handwriting. Real. We heard it. I'd read those words often enough that I could see them with my eyes closed. The 2 people who had written them had never made it there. I wondered whether I was walking toward the same ending. My food was running low again. 1 tin of beans, half a packet of oatmeal, a little jerky. Enough for perhaps 3 days if I stretched it. I found nettles beside a creek on the second afternoon and boiled them that evening with a handful of wild onion. They tasted exactly as they always did. Good enough. By the morning of the 4th day, the river curved north while the track climbed steadily away from it. The map showed a ridgeline before the descent toward the eastern shore. I climbed. About halfway up, I noticed the fence. It wasn't much, just cedar posts with 2 strands of wire between them. Most of it had collapsed years ago, but one section had clearly been repaired. The replacement posts were fresh cut, the bark still clinging to them. The wire had been pulled tight. Someone had fixed it. A little farther on, I crossed a narrow creek on a wooden footbridge. The planks weren't old. Someone had sawn them square. The nails still shone where rain hadn't yet dulled them. I stopped in the middle of the bridge and rested both hands on the rail. For the first time in months, I was looking at something that hadn't simply survived the end of the world. Someone had built it after. The path beyond had been cleared recently. Branches had been lopped back. Fallen trees had been cut into sections and rolled aside instead of forcing travelers to climb over them. I followed it without seeing another zombie. That felt stranger than seeing one. The trees thinned near the top of the ridge. I stepped out onto exposed rock and finally saw the lake. It stretched farther than I could follow, blue-gray beneath the afternoon sun, disappearing into distant mountains that faded almost into the sky. For a moment, I saw nothing else. Then my eyes adjusted. Straight lines, roofs, a long dock extending into the water, rectangles of cultivated earth, wood stacked in neat rows, fishing boats pulled onto shore. A wind turbine turned lazily on a low hill above the shoreline. The settlement wasn't large, perhaps 40 buildings altogether, spread well apart, rather than clustered together. Timber walls enclosed only the central section. Gardens and small fields lay outside them. I could make out people moving between the buildings, too distant to distinguish individually, but unmistakably people. I sat down on the warm rock without thinking about it because my legs had decided they were finished. I stayed there for several minutes, looking down at the settlement and trying to convince myself it wasn't another mistake. Eventually I stood again and continued down the path. The descent took almost an hour. The path widened as it approached the valley floor. Wheel ruts had been worn into the earth. Not many, but enough to tell me carts had traveled this way more than once. I rounded a bend between two outcrops of rock. "That's close enough?" The voice was calm, not loud. I stopped immediately. Two people stepped out from behind the pines ahead. Both carried rifles. Neither pointed them directly at me. One kept his weapon lowered while the other watched the trees behind me instead of watching me. "You're alone?" the older one asked. He looked about 60 and outdoorsy. "Yes." "Anyone behind you?" "No." "Bitten?" "No." He studied me for several seconds. "You carrying any firearms?" "No." He nodded toward my pack. "Set it down." I eased it onto the ground and stepped back. The younger guard searched through it methodically. Food, clothes, camp stove, water filter, bear spray. The laminated map came out last. He unfolded it. His eyes twitched with recognition. "The map is theirs," the younger man said silently. "They came the same way." The older guard nodded quietly. "When I found them, they were gone." I broke the silence.